So in this lesson, we want to look at the differences that exist between metals and non-metals. So when we look at our periodic table, we should be able to relate these differences to the periodic table. Okay, so we will take one difference at a time. So the first difference between metals and non-metals is that metals are good conductors of both heat and electricity. So metals are good conductors of both heat and electricity, whereas our non-metals are not good conductors of heat and electricity. Actually, non-metals do not conduct heat and electricity. Metals have got high melting and boiling points, which means that they are solid at room temperature. So what this means is to bring metals to boil, it takes a very high temperature. So metals will boil at a very high temperature. Remember, when we talk about boiling of metals, we are referring to a process where we apply the amount of heat that is able to give kinetic energy to the particles that make up the metals to an extent that they begin to separate. So metals have got high boiling points and high melting points. Non-metals have got lower melting and boiling points, and actually many of them are gases at room temperature. Metals are hard, they are strong, and will not shatter if you hammer them. In other words, when you take a hammer and you hit the metals, they will not break, whereas solid non-metals will break up easily when you hammer them. So in other words, they are brittle. Metals can be hammered into different shapes. They are malleable and ductile. These two terms, I'm going to define to you what they mean: malleability and ductility. Malleability is the ability of a material to be worked upon without fracture. So for example, the parts of a car, the outside parts of a car which make the shape of a car, they are hammered or they are forged using hydraulic presses into shape. So that's a property of being ductile, to be able to be shaped into a particular shape without breaking. Ductility is the ability of a material to be drawn into wire without fracture. So for example, if we look at copper can be drawn into wires that transport electricity without fracture. So any material that is ductile, it means that it's a material that can be drawn into wire without that material breaking. Whereas non-metals, they are solid and are not ductile or malleable. They are brittle. If you try to shape them into a certain shape, they will break. If you try to draw them into wire, they will break. Metals look shiny when they are polished, whereas non-metals look dull in their solid state. They are hard to polish. So when you take a metal and you polish it, could it be copper, could it be aluminium, could it be steel? When it is freshly cut, it is shiny. When it is polished, it can be made to be shiny. Whereas non-metals, you will not be able, they are hard to polish. Metals are sonorous, and non-metals will break up when hit. When we are talking about a material being sonorous, we are talking about a material that produces sound when it is hit, a ringing sound. So metals do produce a ringing sound when they are hit, whereas non-metals, when you hit them, they will not, they will just produce a low dull sound and actually break. Metals are high in density, whereas non-metals are low in density. So when you look at non-metals, they will be big, whereas they will be having low weight. So non-metals are low in density, whereas metals are high in density. This is one of the properties, being high in density, that makes metals to have a high melting and boiling point. Remember, most materials that are high in density will take a high temperature to melt it and to boil it. Metals form positive ions when they react, whereas non-metals will often form negative ions upon reacting. Metals will react with oxygen to form oxides, which are bases. Non-metals will react with oxygen to form acidic bases. So we all know what it is when we say reacting with oxygen to form oxides. Like for example, iron reacts with oxygen to form iron oxide, which is what we commonly call rust. This is what they mean. And on the other hand, non-metals will react with oxygen to form acidic bases. So these are the main differences of metals and non-metals. But however, we should remember that we do have exceptions. We have cases where we have exceptions. So in the next video, we will briefly discuss about the exceptions that exist between the differences of metals and non-metals. So let's go ahead watching the video in the lesson.